The comment came during dessert at my cousin's engagement party, delivered with the casual cruelty that wealthy families often mistake for wit. Aunt Carol had been holding court at the head table, explaining to the assembled relatives why certain people were naturally suited for business success while others were destined for service sector mediocrity. Business acumen is inherited, she declared, gesturing with her champagne flute toward the room full of successful family members. You either have the instinct for strategic thinking and capital management or you don't. Poor people can't understand business because they've never had access to real money. They think small because they are small. The table erupted in appreciative laughter. Uncle James nodded sagely. Cousin Brittany leaned in with fascination. Even the wait staff, earning hourly wages to serve this celebration, continued pouring wine and clearing plates while being discussed as though they were a different species. Take my niece Emma here, Carol continued, turning her attention to me with a patronizing smile. Sweet girl works very hard at her little retail job. But she could never run a business because she doesn't understand how money really works. Stick to your minimum wage job, honey. Leave the strategic thinking to people who were born for it. The laughter that followed was genuinely amused rather than malicious. My family wasn't being intentionally cruel. They simply viewed economic stratification as a natural law, like gravity or photosynthesis. People were born into their appropriate financial categories, and attempting to transcend those boundaries was as futile as a house cat trying to become a lion. I smoothed my target dress, carefully chosen for tonight's performance, and smiled graciously. You're absolutely right, Aunt Carol. I wouldn't even know where to begin with business strategy. More appreciative chuckles. Several relatives exchanged knowing looks that said, at least Emma knows her place. I finished my store-bought cake and excused myself to use the restroom, where I spent several minutes reviewing the financial documents I'd loaded onto my phone earlier that day. Carol's Luxury Resorts. $47 million invested through Pinnacle Holdings LLC. Uncle James's Tech Consulting. $23 million through Strategic Growth Partners. Cousin Brittany's Fashion Line. $18 million through Meridian Capital Group. Various smaller family ventures. $162 million through 12 different shell companies. Total anonymous family investment portfolio. $250 million across 17 different relatives' businesses. I returned to the party and spent another hour making pleasant conversation about my little retail job, while mentally calculating the economic impact of what I was planning to do Thursday morning. Wednesday night, I sat in my modest apartment reviewing quarterly reports from my investment management firm. Blackstone Private Wealth had been handling my portfolio for 8 years, ever since I'd inherited $50 million from my maternal grandmother and decided to see how far strategic investing could take me. The answer, as it turned out, was very far indeed. Current net worth, $640 million. Annual passive income, $89 million. Assets under management across all portfolios, $1.3 billion. I'd built this wealth slowly and carefully, reinvesting profits from early tech investments into diversified holdings across multiple sectors. Real estate, biotechnology, renewable energy, international markets. I'd learned to identify undervalued opportunities and scale positions efficiently. But my most interesting investments had been in family businesses. It started with Carol's first resort venture 5 years ago. She'd needed $12 million in expansion capital and had struggled to find sophisticated investors willing to back a hospitality startup. Through Pinnacle Holdings LLC, I'd provided the funding that allowed her to purchase her second property and establish the luxury brand that now generated $15 million annually. Carol had no idea that Pinnacle Holdings was a shell company controlled by her minimum wage niece who supposedly couldn't understand business concepts. The pattern had repeated across the family. James needed technology infrastructure funding. Brittany required manufacturing capital for her fashion line. Various cousins had sought investment for restaurants, consulting firms, retail stores, and service businesses. In each case, my shell companies had provided the anonymous backing that enabled their success. From their perspective, they were brilliant entrepreneurs who'd impressed sophisticated investors with their business acumen. From my perspective, I was running an experiment in family dynamics, observing how wealthy relatives treated someone they perceived as economically inferior, while secretly controlling the capital that made their wealth possible. The results had been illuminating and depressing in equal measure. Thursday morning, I called Diana Chin, my senior wealth manager at Blackstone. Diana, I need to liquidate all family-related investments. Every shell company, Every family business, complete withdrawal. Emma, that's $250 million across 17 different ventures. Are you certain about this timing? I'm certain. May I ask what's changed? Most of these investments are performing well above market averages. I looked out my apartment window at the city skyline. Several buildings in the financial district house the family businesses I'd been anonymously supporting. Carol's corporate headquarters occupied 3 floors of a premium office tower. James's consulting firm had expanded to 4 major cities. Brittany's fashion brand was being sold in department stores nationwide. All of it built on capital from someone they considered too poor and ignorant to understand business. The investments no longer align with my values, I said. I understand. How do you want to structure the withdrawals? We could phase them over several months to minimize disruption. No. I want immediate liquidation. All positions, all companies today. Diana was quiet for a moment. Emma, immediate withdrawal of $250 million from 17 different companies will create severe financial distress across multiple businesses. Several of them may face bankruptcy within weeks. That's their responsibility to manage. It's also going to impact hundreds of employees who work for these companies. I considered this factor carefully. Carol's Resorts employed approximately 300 people across 4 locations. James's consulting firm had 85 employees. Brittany's fashion line supported another 120 workers across design, manufacturing, and retail operations. Combined with smaller family ventures, my withdrawal would potentially affect over 800 jobs. Diana, what percentage of those employees would you estimate earn less than $60,000 annually? Probably 70 to 80%. Hospitality, retail, and consulting support roles don't typically pay high wages. And what percentage of the family members who own these businesses inherited their startup capital from previous generations? Based on the family financial history you've shared with me, most of them. Your family has generational wealth dating back several decades. So when I withdraw my funding, the people most likely to lose their jobs are working-class employees, while the people who will suffer ownership losses are already wealthy enough to absorb the financial impact. That's an accurate assessment. Proceed with the liquidation, I said. Complete withdrawal effective immediately. The first phone call came at 11:32 a.m. Carol's name appeared on my phone screen, but I let it go to voicemail. Emma, honey, I hope you're having a good day. I'm calling because I'm getting some confusing messages from our investors, and I thought maybe with your retail experience you might have some insight into customer service issues. Call me back when you get a chance. Her tone was still condescending, still assuming that my retail experience might be relevant to whatever minor administrative problem she was facing. The second call came at 1:47 p.m., this time with noticeable tension in Carol's voice. Emma, I really need to speak with you. Pinnacle Holdings just terminated our partnership agreement. They want their entire investment back immediately, $47 million. That's not how business investments work. Someone must have made a mistake. Please call me back. By 3:15 p.m., I had 8 missed calls from various family members. The voicemails told the story of their afternoon. Confusion turning to concern, turning to panic as they realized the scope of what was happening. James, 2:23 p.m. Emma, something weird is happening with our business investors. All of them are pulling out on the same day. Since you work in retail, you might understand customer relations better than I do. Can you help me figure out what's going on? Brittany, 2:45 p.m. Emma, I need your advice. My investors are demanding immediate repayment of their entire investment. $18 million. I don't understand why this is happening. Maybe your work experience could help me understand how to handle difficult customers. Even in crisis, they were asking for my help while simultaneously dismissing my capabilities. At 4:30 p.m. my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Carol standing in my hallway with 2 other family members, James and cousin Michael. All 3 looked like they'd aged 5 years since the engagement party 2 nights ago. I opened the door. Emma, thank God you're here, Carol said, pushing past me into my apartment. We've been trying to reach you all day. James and Michael followed her inside, their expressions mixing desperation with embarrassment at needing help from the family member they'd been mocking as financially illiterate. What's going on? I asked, gesturing for them to sit on my second-hand furniture. Carol collapsed onto my couch, holding her head in her hands. Someone is systematically destroying our businesses. All of our major investors pulled out today. Same-day coordinated attack. $250 million total. That sounds terrible, I said, sitting across from them in my thrift store armchair. It gets worse, James added. Without that funding, none of us can make payroll next month. We can't fulfill existing contracts. We can't maintain operations. The banks are already calling about loan guarantees. Michael leaned forward. Emma, we need your help. Not with money. We know you don't have that kind of resources. But you work with customers every day. You understand how to solve problems with difficult people. Maybe you could help us figure out how to negotiate with these investors. I looked at the 3 family members who'd spent decades treating me like I was too poor and ignorant to understand their sophisticated business operations, now sitting in my modest apartment asking for advice about difficult customers. What makes you think these investors are being difficult? I asked. Because they're demanding immediate repayment instead of following normal investment timelines, Carol explained. Investors don't just pull out all at once unless someone convinces them to coordinate an attack. Why would anyone want to attack your businesses? We don't know. Carol's voice cracked with frustration. Maybe a competitor? Maybe someone who's jealous of our success? Maybe someone who thinks we don't deserve what we've built. I nodded thoughtfully. Who have you talked to about your business success recently? Nobody unusual. Just family at Brittany's engagement party. We were discussing business strategy, entrepreneurship, natural talent for commerce. What specifically did you say about business strategy? Carol looked confused by the question. Just general observations about who has business instincts and who doesn't. How some people are naturally suited for strategic thinking while others are better in service roles. Did you mention any specific examples of people who aren't suited for business? Well, Carol glanced at James and Michael, clearly uncomfortable with where this conversation was heading. We might have made some general comments about economic backgrounds and business understanding. What kind of comments? James jumped in. Carol might have mentioned that people from certain economic backgrounds can't really understand business strategy because they've never had access to significant capital. And that people in minimum wage jobs should stick to what they know instead of trying to think strategically, Michael added. I kept my expression neutral. Those sound like reasonable observations about economic mobility and business education. Relief was visible on their faces. Exactly, Carol said. We weren't being mean. We were just being realistic about natural aptitudes and economic limitations. So you don't think your investor crisis is related to those comments? How could it be? Carol asked. We were just talking to family. Nobody there has connections to major investment firms. I stood up and walked to my home office, returning with my laptop. I opened my investment management dashboard and turned the screen toward them. Actually, I said, somebody there has extensive connections to major investment firms. All 3 of them stared at my screen for a long moment. Investment portfolio overview. $1.3 billion in assets under management. Personal net worth. $640 million. Recent transactions. $250 million liquidated from family business investments. Carol spoke first, her voice barely a whisper. What is this? My investment portfolio. James leaned forward, reading the numbers more carefully. This says you have $600 million. Personal net worth. Assets under management are higher. Michael was scanning the transaction history. It shows liquidation of positions in Carol's luxury resorts, James's tech consulting, Brittany's fashion line. Carol looked up at me with dawning comprehension. You're the investor. All of them. Pinnacle Holdings, Strategic Growth Partners, Meridian Capital Group. Those are your companies. Those are shell companies I control, yes. You've been funding our businesses. For years. For 5 years in your case. 3 years for James. 2 years for Brittany. The room was completely silent for several minutes. I could see them processing the implications. Every expansion, every success, every moment of pride in their business achievements had been subsidized by the family member they dismissed as too poor to understand commerce. But why? Carol finally asked. Why would you invest in our businesses without telling us? Because I wanted to see how you'd treat someone you thought had nothing to offer you financially. James stood up abruptly, beginning to pace around my small living room. This is insane. You're telling me that you've been secretly wealthy this entire time, funding our companies while we treated you like someone too poor to understand business, I finished. But you never corrected us. You never said anything about your wealth. I wanted to observe your natural behavior toward people you perceived as economically inferior. Carol's face had gone pale. And now you're destroying our businesses because we were honest about economic stratification and business aptitude? I'm withdrawing my investments because you used success that I made possible to demonstrate your superiority over the person who made it possible. Michael stopped pacing and looked at me directly. Emma, what you said at the party, about not knowing where to begin with business strategy. Was that a lie? No. I genuinely don't know where to begin with your business strategy, because it's based on inherited wealth and anonymous investment rather than the business acumen you think you possess. The words hung in the air between us. Carol looked down at her hands. James sat back down heavily. Michael continued staring at me like he'd never seen me before. What happens now? Carol asked quietly. To our companies, I mean. To our employees. That depends on what you've learned from this experience. I've learned that making assumptions about people's capabilities based on their apparent economic status can have catastrophic consequences. What else? Carol thought for a moment. I've learned that the success I was so proud of wasn't really my achievement alone. It was built on support I didn't acknowledge or appreciate. And I've learned that treating family members as inferior because of their perceived economic limitations is not only cruel, but potentially financially devastating. I reopened my laptop and pulled up a new document. I'm willing to consider reinvestment under different terms. What kind of terms? First, I want acknowledgement that your business success was built on anonymous family investment, not superior business genetics. Of course. Second, I want public apologies for comments about poor people being unable to understand business. Carol nodded. I'll post something on social media today. Third, I want changes to how you treat and discuss employees at your companies. No more comments about minimum wage workers lacking strategic thinking abilities. Agreed. Fourth, I want transparency about the source of your funding. No more pretending you impressed sophisticated investors with your natural business instincts. James spoke up. That's going to be embarrassing. We've built our professional reputations on the idea that we're self-made entrepreneurs. Then you'll have to build new professional reputations based on honesty about how business success actually works. I typed up a preliminary reinvestment agreement and showed it to them. $200 million in new funding across all family businesses, structured as acknowledged family investment rather than anonymous backing. Carol read through the terms carefully. This is actually more transparent and sustainable than our previous arrangement. Clear governance, honest relationships, better oversight. It's what happens when you treat family members as partners rather than charity cases. All three of them signed the agreement, then spent several minutes looking around my modest apartment with new understanding. Emma, Carol said finally, I owe you an apology. Not just for what I said at the party, but for years of treating you like someone who needed our pity rather than someone who was making our success possible. Apology accepted. And I need to completely rethink how I talk about economic success and business ability. That would be appropriate. James gathered his papers and headed toward my door. At the threshold he turned back. One more question. When you said I was absolutely right about poor people not understanding business, did you mean that or were you already planning this withdrawal? I smiled. I meant that you were absolutely right about poor people not understanding business. I just didn't agree that I was poor. Over the next few months, I watched my family's attitudes shift as they processed the new reality. Public apologies were posted on social media. Employee treatment policies were revised across all family companies. Most importantly, the assumption that economic status correlated with business intelligence was permanently corrected. The family businesses recovered stronger than before with better capitalization and more honest leadership. The 800-plus employees kept their jobs, and several were promoted as the companies expanded into markets I'd identified through my research. But the most significant change was in how the family discussed success and capability. The narrative shifted from inherited business genes to collaborative achievement, from natural superiority to mutual support. 6 months later at the next family gathering, Carol stood up to make a toast. I want to acknowledge that our family's business success has been built not on individual genius, but on the contributions of every family member, including those whose contributions we failed to recognize or appreciate. Our strength comes from supporting each other, not from dismissing people based on their apparent economic status. She raised her glass toward me. To Emma, who taught us that business understanding isn't about inheriting wealth, it's about creating value and treating people with respect. The family toasted, but more importantly, they had learned to